Good afternoon, folks. We're here for the latest edition of the South Florida Arboriculture and Landscaping Professional webinar series. If you could go ahead and just keep yourselves muted and your videos off, we deeply appreciate it. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A session. So we'll try and save at least 10 minutes for that. So save your questions for the end. We'll be screening the chat box too at times if there's anything that comes up that's pertinent. But other than that, I'm going to pass it off here to today's speaker, Dr. Andrew Koeser, from the Environmental Horticulture Department at UF and the Gulf Coast Research and Education Center. So, he'll be talking about defects and things that don't look like defects potentially. So I'm going to go ahead and give you the controls here, Andrew, and looking forward to the talk here.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Thank you all for having me. I'm going to share my screen. And get this thing full screen. I just love how the zoom bar always goes right where I don't want it to be. So let me do this. There we go. Great. Let me move the zoom bar again. Anyways, okay. So thank you very much for having me. This is kind of the freshest stuff I have from my lab. Actually, the paper just dropped last week in forests, where we looked at 4 key defects that it's been kind of a journey where we've looked at data sets from different storms around the Southeast. And I've just seen patterns of these things not really being good predictors of storm damage. So without giving away too much, this is trees and storms, which defects are truly defective. So trees, the growth is a balance for trees. And when you talk about tree biomechanics, it's that we often talk about this balance between being strong enough and withstanding all the storms you can, and then like counteracting like the other needs trees have, which are, reaching skyward for the light. Here's an example of 2 different extremes of this. The juniper on the left is one that we see in the landscape a lot as a ground cover. This thing will never blow away in a hurricane. This thing is low and tight to the ground, but it also would never survive in the wild without horticultural intervention, right? This is something that we saw. It looked novel and unique, and we propagate it. But it just doesn't reach skyward and to light where it needs to be competitive in an environment out in the wild. So trees have this balance where they're just trying to really just not build too much and too low and too rigid, and yet still be competitive and not blow away in windstorms. In forests, we see trees working together in groups. Trees have a very different form often than what we see in our urban environments. This oak hickory forest, you can see here, trees are packed in quite tight. They're in a shade, or a sunlight limiting environment. So they're growing skyward pretty much solely in that direction, just to capture as much light as they can and hopefully overtop some of their peers, right? And that is a form that we try to mimic in arboriculture quite a bit. This is a strong form, having one main leader and smaller subordinate branches that have been shaded out. But it is not often something that we get in the urban environment, because once you have light in all sides, all the branches are competitive and they all start growing for their own little slice of the sky, and we often have a much different form, a much broader decurrent form on these same species. Other species like cypress, they have very strong hormonal controls, and they'll stay quite excurrent, quite Christmas tree shaped, regardless of their environment until they get really old and start flattening out a little bit. So, and this branch failure in urban environment or in forested environments, shade's kind of driving that a lot of the time. What happens is those side branches just can't keep up with the rest of the canopy. They're not being helped by the trunk themselves. Every branch is on its own and needs to sustain both itself, and then whatever's left over goes to the main trunk. And those that can't keep up and can't sustain themselves just die off, and they break off at a very small size compared to the parent stem, because they've been flagging for a while. This is not an overnight thing. This is season after season of them just slowly losing the game and then breaking off. So we try to mimic this in our pruning. We try to subordinate branches that we want to be the losers, and those are the ones that they can't keep up with the rest of the canopy, and eventually we remove them at the main stem with a removal cut, and they're much smaller than they would have been if they were still co-dominant, fighting with the main central leader for dominance. Failures in the forest, they look quite different often than we see in an urban environment. We do see trees toppling over in urban environments, especially when we have like root limiting conditions and root damage through construction. But it's more of a common thing in forested environments. And stem breakage for sure is more common in forested environments than we see in the city, because trees that are grown in tight groups like that often don't develop the same taper that we see in urban environments. And in fact, we tried to recreate some of Mary Duryea's work where we looked at groups of trees in urban environments. And we've done it now twice with 2 different storms with the spacings we normally see in urban environments. And we've found that there's no relationship between the location of groups of trees and trees that are next to each other. A tree next to another tree is not more likely to fail if that one next to it fails already, right? So we just see, like, in urban areas, in the conditions that we normally see, which are kind of park-like savanna settings, every tree is kind of in it on their own. They're going to survive or not survive based on their own attributes in many of the densities that we see. Whereas in this wood forest environment, once you have like a break in like the edge of the forest, things start going really quickly and snapping in unison, because those trees have never been exposed to winds. They've been kind of protected in the interior. I'm not going to go too much into this, but there are forestry models that are quite robust that have looked at a lot of things, such as species, height, diameter, spacing, soil type, drainage, wind speed, all sorts of things, trying to look at why trees and forests fail and why they stand. And the standing ones, probably why trees stand after a storm is probably the more interesting question that we should be looking at, right? But we don't have that rich data set to build these kind of models as much in urban environments. And also we have a lot more diversity. Often these things are kind of uniform monocultures, where they have really nice systems that they can model, and everything. We could have a couple hundred species in the Miami area, or 200 in Tampa. So in contrast, we also see in urban forests a lot fewer whole tree failures than what we see. These are 2 storms that I looked at: Hurricane Matthew, that was in Savannah, and Charleston, South Carolina. This was Hurricane Matthew. It was a tropical storm when it hit these 2 areas. We had 1% of our trees, which is like 1,200 or so, failed enough where the tree was removed or fell over. 6% of the trees had branch failure, but the vast majority of these trees in tropical storm weather had no damage whatsoever that was discernible by the crews, right? And then Hurricane Irma, a little bit sooner, more recent storm, this was in Tampa, again, like 1,500 trees or so. This was a little bit more intense, I think category 1 when it hit Tampa area. 80% of the trees, no damage that was discernible whatsoever to my crews. 7% had enough damage to warrant removal, or the whole tree fell over. And then again, branch failure is much more common. And that makes sense. We have a lot of branches on our trees. This is the Baranoff oak in Safety Harbor. I mean, this tree itself is essentially a vertical forest with every one of those main stems as big as some of those plantation specimens that we saw in the forestry example, right? So we're managing multiple trees essentially when we have these big oaks with the massive stems that they have. So here's a little thought experiment for you that I think relates to defects a little bit. So when it was the heat of COVID, it was like 2020, and my car at the time had electrical gremlins, and I needed to buy another car because I just couldn't put up with sensors going left and right over and over again, right? It just was an inconvenience. And I needed a vehicle. I wasn't in the market for anything. It wasn't something that I was like looking for and trying to get. It just kind of popped in my lap. And I had a couple of requirements. I wanted the cheapest vehicle that could fit all four of my children and maybe a basset hound that I could afford, right? And that those were the parameters. That was a very limited model right there. And I quickly honed in on the Kia Sorento, right? And this is a car that I never thought about before. It was not something I dreamed about. I didn't have posters of this in my bedroom or anything like that. I just bought it. I enjoy it. I've got 100,000 miles on it now, and I travel a lot for the state. And it's treated me well. But the thing is, the moment I bought this car, which I never thought of before, I couldn't tell this from Adam on the street, I started seeing the Kia Sorento everywhere I looked, right? Every parking lot there was one. Every time I'm driving on the road, I saw one. And has anyone in the audience ever kind of experienced that, where you bought a shirt and popped up, or you have when I first bought a basset hound, the same thing happened, right? So I think the same thing occurs when we learn species. You know, when you first learn dendrology and you start learning the species in the forest, you can't go in the forest and enjoy that walk anymore. You're looking at all the species and trying to figure out what's out there. And the same thing is once you get into like tree structure and function, or your arboricultural class, you took track for the first time. Now you start seeing defects everywhere you look, right? And you know, there's guides. This has come back from like 1983. Shigo had a tree defects photo guide. This is kind of an expansion of his CODIT model, which is compartmentalization of decay in trees. And what it is an expanded concept of decay and CODIT used to examine many tree problems. Discolored and decayed wood are major tree problems that can cause low quality in trees. A better understanding of these defects make it possible to begin growing healthier and higher quality trees in our forests and cities. And there's a lot of guides out there. You know, there are books by like Ed Hayes on the body language of trees, which I have right here, a great book. If you can get a copy of this, it's several $100s. My daughter used it as a coloring book once. That was unfortunate. You know, the new version of that book, which is nearly as good. Even the track manual, you know, like the most detailed and, you know, chapter of that whole book is on the defects, right? And they give way more detail about how to interpret defects than how to interpret the site for occupancy, or how to interpret whether a tree is going to squash your house or not for consequences of failure. It is by far the lion's share of the content, both in that, like in those three factors, and then also when you look at the form itself. I think there's like nearly 40 defects that you can look through if you start filling out the track form. So it's no surprise that when we're out there as arborists, we see tree defects and they kind of haunt our dreams, right? And we put a lot of thought into these, and there's a lot at stake when we risk assess based on these visual tree defects. And it shows up in the literature. This is one of the first projects I ever did when I first came to Florida. And we just had people look at various scenes where we changed random things, like how close the tree was to a target, what type of target it was, whether it was a person or a car or a house, the tree species, whether it was a live or a laurel oak, the tree size, whether it was small, medium, large, and then, you know, the value of the target. And what we did is we randomized all these scenarios. We had people just give a gut 1 to 10 rating of risk. And we found that the defect was over half of the decisions being made. You know, everything else, even the proximity to the target, which if proximity was, not in range, which was one of the options, the risk should have been tanked, didn't really resonate with people. People were focusing on those defects. And I see that in our data. This is data from this is from the Hurricane Matthew paper. This was collected by a major tree care company, the second largest in the country. And their crews, which were professional crews, in 2,069 trees, they only found 10 trees that didn't have a single defect in them, right? And again, 93% of those trees didn't fail, right? The median number of defects per tree was 2, and the maximum number of defects were 6 on one unfortunate tree that was just pretty gnarly, right? So what does this mean? Well, if you look back at what Shigo was working on, Shigo was a forest pathologist working for the Forest Service, and his main goal was making marketable timber, right? They had problems with pruning branches to remove knots and things like that, and decay forming. And a lot of that work that we've translated into arboriculture came from a forestry sector where major tree problems were those problems that caused low quality in trees. Not made them blow over, but made their wood stained or otherwise unsellable, right? So when we look at when we focus on defects so much, but what happens when we actually look at the trees that don't have defects, right? This happens so rare. I don't even do this myself, but the problem is I was kind of beating myself up, but then I realized most of my trees have defects. Only a few, maybe a handful in my data sets usually don't have any of the 40 some defects that ISA typically has us assess, right? So, but in earlier times, Gilbert and Greg, they were only looking at 3 main defects, including included bark and codominance and things like that. And they were able to do a comparison of failure rates for defective trees and non-defective trees. And in this research, which came out of London during their Great Storm of 1987, they had a failure rate of defective trees of 21.4%. And then, when you compare that to the trees that didn't have any defects in it, 18.6% of those trees still failed, right? Brian Kane, he used the Forest Service's method of risk assessment, which I think had maybe 12 or so defects on it. It's still available. I used it for some of my research. And his failure rate for defects present was 7.8%. And his failure rate for trees that had no defects was 21.8%. So there's actually more trees without defects failing in a windstorm in like Martha's Vineyard or one of those vacation areas up north on campgrounds. These are some precursors to the type of data that I like to collect. There are all sorts of studies where people will take some included bark branch unions and yank them apart with some sort of torture device, like that they use in engineering for materials testing. And those are great because they get us an idea of strength loss, right? How much strength is lost by having included bark or codominant stems or an aspect ratio that's just not ideal. The problem is we don't know if that's too much loss in strength. What we really need to know is how much strength is needed to survive a windstorm in our area. And to do that, we need, in my mind, a data set where trees have been risk assessed beforehand. When you do that, there's, when you go after the fact, which has been done in the past, you may only focus on the worst of the worst and get really kind of awed by the trees that are down in the road and go to those neighborhoods and stuff like that. But when you have an existing data set, you already have the things you need to go back to, and you see everything. You see the stuff that made it, the stuff that didn't, the hidden defects that you didn't even know existed until they were brought to light by the storm. So having that is really important. You need a storm to hit within the time frame of your risk assessment data set, right? So we risk assess on a 3 or a 5 year period, mostly 3 now in Florida or lower. And so we need that storm to hit when that data is still valid. Otherwise, you've missed your window, which is kind of frustrating for folks like me who invest a lot in collecting pre-data. That data has to be timely, and then you need the resources afterwards to go in there and get the data. I've had rapid funds from NSF that were supposed to come, after Irma. They came 18 months after the storm. That's not rapid at all, but maybe for the federal government, right? But so in the meantime, we had to do the data collection ourselves and just hope to get payback, so we came to writing the stuff up. And I forgot to mention, the storm has to be the right storm too. It has to be like the Goldilocks storm. It can't be too weak, where it's not really a storm, and it can't be too severe, like can't be Hurricane Andrew, because we can't manage trees for that anyway. So you need all these things to kind of align to actually do this kind of research. And that's why you're going to see this research is pretty rare. So I recently did, see my time. Yeah, I gotta speed up a little bit. So recently did a lit review. This just came out in Frontiers recently, with Allison Salisbury, a colleague of mine from Rutgers, works in my lab as well. And we looked at hurricanes, cyclones, typhoons, all the kind of tropical storms that inhabit our various oceans in this world, looking for things that people use to predict storm damage, just like we like to do, and when we looked at these models, things that are common data like DBH and species were measured often in research, which gives a lot to work with for those. So we found 44 studies, 11 of them were urban, and we look at the things that arborists kind of look at. We have DBH, species, wind speed, what the crown looked like, if they were pruned or not, if there were defects present, and we looked at all these things, and they showed up relatively abundantly for some, but when we look at the things that we fixate on, which are defects in our industry, there were only 3 at the time of this study, and now I've added a few more. So we have now 5 studies in kind of all the history of research that are kind of feeding our knowledge of what defects do in windstorms. But the first of these studies is quite, this one's awesome. This happened way before everything else. This is by Gary Hickman, Janet Caprill, and Ed Perry out of California. And what they did is they wanted to look at oak trees and how they survived with an oak-specific kind of risk assessment form. And the follow-up paper, so this was 89 when they introduced the system. In 1995, they went back to see how their system looked, which is just amazing, right? The foresight. They had 695 trees that they assessed in a natural park in Lodi, California. They had their own 9-component rating system, and then they went back to see what failed, and 60 trees had failed, which it was about 10%. I'm blocking my stats here with the Zoom stuff. But they had a good number of trees failed. And this was a park where it was a natural area, so they only removed trees after they failed, right? They weren't doing a whole lot of mitigation beforehand, which was kind of a nice system for this kind of work. Okay, there, I totally minimized this thing. Now I can actually see my slides. So they looked at soil, how much of the soil was available for rooting, and if there was pavement over the roots. They looked at root cutting, wounds and decay and loose bark in the butt of the tree, in the trunk of the tree, in the limbs of the tree, leans in degrees, and then wind exposure, how many sides of the tree were exposed to wind, and then visual declines in health, which is a very important measure if you're doing any kind of tree management. The next storm that was studied was the one I told you about by Brian Kane in Brewster, Massachusetts. This was in the campground. They had a windstorm of 100 miles per hour. It wasn't a hurricane. It was just like a kind of a straight line windstorm. And these campsites have been both assessed and mitigated with the USDA Forest Service method. So this study was cool because they actually had pruning and removal maintenance that they could see if the pruning actually did anything. They collected species and genus information on the trees, whether the tree failed, and if it failed at the branch, root, or trunk, if the tree had been pruned in the past year, whether nearby trees around that tree had been removed, giving it new wind exposure, And then they looked for dead branches, decay, cavities, poor branch attachments, and cut roots. Next study was by myself and Tom Smiley and Bartlett folks. This is the one that was in Charleston and Savannah. This thing hit as a category 1, but it diminished much lower as it hit Charleston. 269 trees using the ISA tree risk assessment form, the track form, and we looked at defects and likelihood of failure ratings as our predictors. This one again hit at generally at what we call the Goldilocks. I like to call the Goldilocks zone, which is tropical storm level, 53 miles per hour in Savannah and 43 miles per hour in Charleston. Then we also, this was done by Brian Kane and myself and Ryan Klein, and then Michael Nelson, who's the lead author and a whiz-bang kind of geospatial analyst from UMass. And we had some data from Tampa where we were looking at using both the spatial statistics and our USDA defects, the Forest Service method to predict failure. So these were, we just had a bunch of projects we were doing in Tampa. So we had a ton of trees. And our team that both did the initial assessments was still around to do the post assessment, which was really nice. And we had 2,394 trees. So a good sample size for this study. This was category 1, a little bit higher than I probably wanted, but it was 78 miles per hour with sustained winds of 50 miles per hour. And we looked at things like cankers, cracks, dead branches, decayed branches, poor architecture, root problems, and weak branch unions. So what I'm going to do, so I told you there's 5. We have more. The last study is kind of the one I'll show you was the newest one, which I just published. But for these first 4, what I'm going to show you is a defect from the track manual. And if it has a green arrow going up, that means that defect increased the likelihood of that tree failing in the storm. If it has a green arrow going down, which happens a few times, oddly, that defect will be associated in the models with lower likelihood of failure. And if it's going side to side, it means that it was measured, but there was no significant finding. It didn't predict either increased or decreased likelihood of failure. And then if the title, if it's actually missing, if there's no mention of a paper there, that means that they did not study the defect. So looking at cracks, cracks can be shear plane cracks where we have kind of a break where the tension and the compression side of a tree are kind of pulling against each other and there's slippage that can be combined with decay, or in the worst case scenario, you can actually have horizontal cracks going across the fibers, and that's definitely a move the car scenario. So these have kind of a range of severity based on professional judgment, which is what fed into the track manual largely. But the 2 studies where we had cracks in the data set, we were not able to see any kind of predictive ability to see whether or not they predicted increased or decreased failure. Codominant stems. Cracks are kind of rare, I will say, and that could be why they did not predict failure. But codominant stems are a dime a dozen in our urban trees. So these are more prevalent, right? We can have both U-shaped attachments, which tend to be stronger. Kind of the work from Duncan Slater shows that there's fibers that intermingle at the top juncture, which kind of make up for the fact that there isn't a nice collar that we normally see, like on a lateral branch. V-shaped weak branches the V-shaped branches tend to be weaker in our viewpoint, especially because they can often have included bark. But in our study, we actually keep codominant stems separate from included bark branches. But the studies that have codominant stems, there's 3 of them. Not a single one of them has found that they predicted failure in windstorms. Codominants have included bark. Again, the first study that one in California didn't find anything. And then our study, the one I did with Tom Smiley in Charleston, Savannah, We actually found that included bark, the trees that had it had less failure, which was kind of alarming. But what in that case, the only trees that had included bark in that entire study set were live oak. So I think that is definitely a species impact in that data. But it's what we saw, and so that is something to consider when you're assessing live oak. I'm not saying they're stronger, but they just didn't have any problems. Sprouts and adventitious shoots. If the tree has been damaged by a storm or by an ill-trained arborist through heading, improper heading cuts, you can have a lot of sprouts growing back as the tree tries to recover and build a new canopy. And, as they mature and become the new canopy, they aren't that bad, but there's that rough point in between where we don't know what's going to happen, right? And then if you have decay at the cut or broken branch ends, that can compound the severity of these things. Well, there are no studies with this data in the data sets. So we have no research really to back this up. I know that some folks like Jake Meeswell were working on pulling studies with these to see how resilient they are to pulling. Multiple branches emerging from one point. So you have multiple branches emerging from one area, often as an aspect of nursery production. We cut the central leader of a plant and then they branch out so it looks like a tree, not like a whip. When we sell these things, well, at that point you have a lot of branches that eventually get big, and the holding any one branch to what if there even is a central leader is minimized, right? So there's two studies that looked at multiple branches, which is my work with Tom Smiley, and then the study did of Brian Kane in Tampa. No predictive ability with these multiple branches. So at this point I was getting a little downtrodden. I'm like, come on, something's got to give, right? We're doing this meta-analysis kind of, and what this has to be it, broken, dead, hanging branches. These are failures in front of our very eyes. If this is not significant, nothing's going to be, right? Well, yeah, they are. So this was a check on reality for me that things are working, not all the time in the way that we would expect it, but this is one we would definitely hope to see increased failures, and there's solid evidence for that. Seams and ribs, often you have a crack that'll grow over, so you just see the remnant of that crack as the tree growth starts to fill it in, and these can be rated from improbable to probable depending on their severity. And if decay is present, these are so rare, these generally are rare, that they're not any of the data sets, so we have never studied that one. Leans, bowing, and uncorrected leans. So a corrected lean is a tree that has lost stability but regained stability to the point where we see gravitropism taking place and that thing's correcting itself, growing away from the earth again. And that's a sign that things are going well and that tree has stabilized. But before that happens, there's that kind of, again, wait and see moment where we have to see whether or not a tree will stabilize. And if it's, there's a high likelihood that tree can fail. So we need to watch out for targets on the leaning side of that tree. Well, often we don't differentiate between leans and, corrected or uncorrected leans. So we didn't see significant findings in two of the studies, but we did see one in the Gary, Hickman, and Caprill and Perry paper, the first one out of California. So the first defects I showed you were all the ones that are given specific likelihood of failure ratings for the track manual, right? They also list a bunch of defects that don't have any ratings whatsoever, and you just kind of left to your own devices, right? These include overextended branches, which Norm told me he added to the book, injuries, cankers, bulges, ridges, root damage and decay, basal swelling, stem girdling roots, decay, oozing, and cavities. All those are symptoms of decay. So dieback, looked at it in two different papers, and when you see visual dieback in a tree, Hickman and Caprill, they came back like almost 12 years later. And we came back, 2 or 3 years later. Trees don't do anything fast. So they picked up on dieback as a predictor of failure, where we did not, but it makes perfect sense to me. Previous wounds, often previous wounds from us, arborists who are trying to do things with mature trees, like give them a form or things like that, where that ship has sailed a long time ago, right? And we're cutting into heartwood and things like that. Well, previous wounds are also a significant predictor of tree failure, both in the Hickman paper and in my more recent one of Tom Smiley. Deep planting, that can lead to poor root systems and circling roots and girdling roots. We found that was a predictor of failure in the paper at Hurricane Matthew. Decay. Okay, this is another check on reality, right? We would hope that decay in cavities, one of the main things we look at, predicted failure, and in pretty much every paper that was the case. Brian Kane didn't have any stats, but he said that he gave like a throwaway line in his discussion saying that it did increase failure. So stem girdling roots. So I guess that is separate from the deep planting that I showed you earlier. Also included failure. So yeah. So that's where we were. That's kind of like a meta-analysis of all the past research. Looking, I guess meta-analysis is more of a generous term. That's a summation of the past research, looking at defects to see what has been proven statistically to predict a tree falling or staying upright, right? Well, a couple of those surprised me. In particular, the codominant stems, which is quite abundant. Codominant stems with included bark. The multiple branches, which I see all the time in our data sets. And then overextended branches, which didn't surprise me, but it popped up enough in data sets that I was curious in looking at it again. So I vowed, after looking at we made all those charts and stuff that you saw, that PowerPoint's been around for a while. We made that, and I vowed that the next hurricane that hit Florida, if I had trees on the ground where it hit, I would look at those 4 defects in particular to see what happened, after the storm. So it didn't take long. Hurricane Ian hit us last year. It hit us in Fort Myers. And if you want to see the recovery and want to, kind of help out that area, we're having Trees Florida in 3 weeks in Cape Coral. So please come to that meeting and support those local communities as they recover, and the hotels and all the stuff in the area, if you have the ability to, and see some great tree talks at the same time, right? Well, our trees were not at Fort Myers. Ours were in Tampa, well away from the eye of the storm. And so when it hit us, it was category 1 hurricane conditions when our trees in Hillsborough County park system were hit. We had done some work for the parks 2 years ago, before that, I think in 2020. And what we had done is assessed 150 trees, or 150 parks, and over nearly 11,000 trees, doing a risk assessment management plan for the county park system. And what that gave us were these nice little maps. We had every single tree mapped out with a GPS point. So we could go right back to that tree, and we filtered out the data set so that we were only looking at our key defects, which again were codominant stems, which had never been shown to increase likelihood of failure. Codominant stems with included bark, which we had a little weird thing where they actually made them stronger. And then multiple branches, which was never shown to affect failure. And then we added overextended branches, which was I guess not as representative as I thought it was going to be. We only had 12 in our data set. So what we did with that data set is we recorded only the defect of primary concern, the one that was the worst thing on that tree. So we looked at those trees at all 10,000, and the ones where a codominant stem was the worst thing, multiple branches originally from the same point was the worst thing, included bark was the worst thing, or overextended branches. We went to those trees. And when we did so, we only found 14 trees out of the 1,519 failed. So that's like a tenth of a percent, right? And then what we did is I had my crew look, and I'm like, okay, if this thing failed at a codominant stem, right? You see a tear out the same size as the branch next to it, give it a yay, if it, included at a cluster of branches for the multiple branches, give it a yay. But if it didn't fail at a union for those cases that you could tell it was the problem. If it, sometimes we had internodal failures. Actually, all those were probably internodal failures, mid branch or something like that. Then you would say, no, it didn't happen at the defect of concern. And then if you just couldn't tell, you didn't have any confidence that the failure happened where you thought, you could say unsure, because not knowing is fine in science. We want to know what the uncertainty is when we do these models. Well, we couldn't do any modeling because we had 0 trees fail at those defects of concern. And again, people see these things fail all the time, right? And well, in this case we didn't, right? But like, people see codominant stems break out, right? And how can that be, and how can we make sense of that with the data we're seeing and the multiple data sets that have failed to predict based on this? So there's things like dynamic versus static loading. So we often pull on branches in a static way for these testing, which mimics probably gravity the best, or even ice loading. But we're working with dynamic systems with wind loading. This is straight line winds, but even this is kind of dynamic in a way. So ice and snow is just, again, super loading in a static way. But and we've done these studies like Thomas Smalley has, where we've kind of broken apart our branch unions and things like that and found that they're weaker. But and done the same with even like decay pockets that we've kind of made up, in a fake way with chainsaws, just because you can't make decay occur like as you want all the time. And I've done this myself, but these things have their limitations. What we do is we take the strength loss that we see, or the drop in our resilience to this, and we try to back channel it through equations to figure out how much wind is this thing soaking up, how much drag does the canopy have, given its leaf density and things like that, and then the wind density, all these things. Wind density and velocity we can calculate easily, but the other things are kind of a squishy thing to do, right? So that looks like your canopy when there's no wind. But the moment you have wind, your canopy area changes. And how do you calculate that, right? Not only does your canopy change, but the leaf area changes. As soon as leaves get a blast of wind, a lot of them curl up and get as aerodynamic as possible. So it's hard for us to have these, these static equations kind of work out in a meaningful way. And then there's also things like mass dampening, where there's a bunch of branches in a tree and leaves in the tree that they have a lot of weight, and they don't all blow in the same direction. They blow against each other, they crash into each other, and that helps cancel some of the effects of the wind. Just like we see in buildings, where they actually have like these giant suspended weights. This one's filled with water in the Type A tower, and as the wind pushes on the building and pushes it like maybe to the right, the weight will swing to the left and counteract that and make it so you can build a really tall building with a lot less material and still be safe, given the conditions it's exposed to. So it's also worth noting that not all defects are the same. We often have defects listed as a yes or a no when there's a gradient, like not every branch attachment of included bark is the same. They can actually grow over and embed the included bark and be pretty strong, as Duncan Slater's shown in his research. Or so we're not getting all of there could be some included bark unions that are just always going to fail, or in a high predictable manner going to fail, but we need better tools to assess which of those are the ones that are going to do it, and we don't have that at the moment. So but what is clear is that most trees do have defects. given our current definitions. Yet most trees survive storms intact. Kane 2008 saw that 2/3 of the trees that they measured had defects, but only 12% failed in storm. And while defects may reduce strength in mechanical testing, it is unclear how strong the trees need to be. And while some defects are concerning, others may just warrant future investigation. I have to say that I've been watching the research and the BMPs kind of change over the decades as I've done my deep dive into this, and we only seem to be adding defects. No one has ever been like looking like, okay, well, we've added like 10 in the last decade. Should we remove some of these? Are these all things to be concerned about? Which is telling, I think. And there are some real costs to assessing defects that are not defective, which is wasted time when you're working with multiple trees and big populations. When we live in a post 163.045 world where trees on residential property can be removed if they have elevated risk. And this gives us plenty of cover if we have defects that are on the list, even if they don't actually cause problems. So it could be a way to circumvent laws here in Florida. So, and another take-home point is there's like 4 or 5 studies on this, right? So that's not a lot to be placing so much information on. So we need more research. And I know that this talk has been stirring a lot of conversations, and more people are looking to kind of continue this work in other areas of the country, which is great. So that's all I have for now. I'll open it up for questions. And yes, thank you.
All right, folks, if you want to go ahead and throw your questions into the meeting chat, please do so. I'll go and I'll run these by you here, Andrew, that have popped up so far. Yeah, taken from very recent one that popped up. Since trees with cracks can have different likelihood of failure depending on the orientation of the crack, so i.e. like longitudinal or horizontal, has anyone ever compared how different kinds of cracks hold up in storms?
No, there's not I mean, they're, like I said, they're rare. Like the horizontal ones that are going across the fibers this way, those are really rare because they don't last long. So that might be hard to study, but we could the other ones, yeah, I mean, again, they're not something that happens often, and as a result of our own cultural practices where we've been able to study them in any big way, so the answer is
no. Okay, so some of the studies, I mean, you kind of did a literature review, and I'm kind of paraphrasing some of the questions here. What were some of the hurricane studies that you did? What were some of the variables you looked at, like while you were trying to hone in on like the defects that fail? And I guess these are like your big data set ones that you specifically worked on. Did you look at tree species, soil condition? What are some of the other things that are in there?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't have soil because that's something that doesn't show up often in your typical urban forestry inventory assessment, right? And wind speed, we never really look at because it's always essentially the same because these storms are so big, and we're doing like a city at a time, right? So we can I think Ryan does a figure where we compared how wind speed over multiple studies seem to affect species, but it's not something we can model directly, because we're just looking at one-offs in given storms. But species is always important. Every single study where species is measured, there's a species effect. So one of the things that we're working on right now, Allison's working on her second paper, and what she did is she took the 400 and some species, I think it's 400 species that Mary Duryea kind of assessed for like low, medium, and high likelihood of failure, just on species. And she put a bunch of different things like modulus of elasticity and density and all these like origin, nativity to Florida, all these things into a model to see if she could predict which ones would go into those bins, high, medium, low. And she got it to 95% accuracy. So now that we have the there was like those things that we put in the model were the unsaid kind of understood things that arborists knew from experience, maybe they didn't know exactly, and now we can apply those to more species, right? So we can just take that predictive model and start applying it to the things that weren't on our list and start filling voids on people's lists for cities in the state and beyond. So
Okay, I've got a question here. To give a rough estimate for measuring the root systems. So I don't know how much you were able to look at this, but is it twice the diameter of the canopy?
I mean, that is that's one of the things that's thrown out there, but like that's not your supporting root system, right? That's your root system that is, you know, reaching out for nutrients and water as well, like the feeder roots. Whereas the structural root system is kind of the more the core towards, you know, within the critical root zone of a tree, you know.
So do you think that this research like impacts like grades and standards and maybe how I guess like what's done in the nursery all the way through to the structural side of pruning as well?
I think you could, I mean, I think like codominant stems for the species we're looking at, which often includes live oak, let's say that too, right? They don't seem to be that big of a deal. You know, like I think there like it'll definitely be a stronger shape if you have that X current one central leader and then smaller branches off to the side. So that but that's part of me thinks that's almost an aesthetic as well, you know, like, and I kind of like the weird looking trees. But that's just me now talking about my opinions, not any, you know, like I like the weird ones.
I've got a question, I guess, about some of the experimental design that you did. Were you only, and I think this is kind of looking at your post-hurricane stuff too. So are you only evaluating total failure of the tree or also failure and breakages of like individual branches and defects?
We are looking at everything. So like there are things like the International Tree Failure Database out there that are like a volunteer driven data initiative, crowdsourcing, trying to figure out failure patterns in trees. And it's primarily active in California, and Pacific Northwest has their own version of this. But the problem with that is it's like the news during a hurricane. They find like that one tree that's down in the road, and that's where they set the shop and they do the filming for the show, right? For the news coverage. It's also what gets caught in those volunteer efforts. People are drawn to the big failures, right? Those are the ones that are going to get you to fill out like a 50 question questionnaire about what happened. We're looking for just branches, like any branch big enough to see on the ground, we're recording, right? And we're also looking at every tree to see which ones didn't have anything fall or tear out. We look for things on the ground, and we look for fresh wounds in the tree that are not like a pruning or even pruning wound if it's a little later. So, but yeah.
So there's a question all the way up at the beginning here. And I guess this probably has to do with like when you were talking about inventories and having like good ideas, data sets where trees are actively inventoried. Somebody said, do you have any information regarding the Masters tournament? I guess it says 2023, but I think that maybe 2022, because I think it's yet to happen. But what measures would need to be done to proactively reduce the potential for any future occurrences at peopled events?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the biggest thing for like the Masters tournament is to get people off the course when there's inclement weather, right? That's the biggest thing. But yeah, I mean, it would be, I'm looking for any data. So golf courses, hospitals, campuses, I don't think UF has this, but anyone who has like data available and has a storm event, and we would love to work with, I think this could be a really good role for the strike teams for the Forest Service, is if you have a pre-data set, if you work for a city and like the storm hits, call Will Liner, Todd Little at the Forest Service, say you want the strike teams to come, and we can work together to collect data that's useful for you for your FEMA, claim, and then also for our research, right? I don't have anything specifically for the master's example, but I think the companies that are doing risk assessment on golf courses, this could be another way that we can get more data, so, and help everyone out.
Well, I guess I don't see any other questions popping up here right now. I'm looking, so you're going to have a continuation of this at Trees, Florida, like
No, is this in my trees florist? I don't know if I was doing this or diversity. One of the
Okay.
two. But yeah, no, this is something I'm working on nonstop. I just got an email from I think one of Rich Hauer's students in Wisconsin who wants to start getting this set up in Wisconsin for ice storms. Just getting and I think that's what we need, is just more people that are aware that this is really easy research to do if you've got the risk data, and it helps us so much. So and yeah, someone's saying that we tend to overestimate the risk associated with defects in general. I would say that's true. I mean, the numbers bear out. If almost every tree has a defect, but not almost every tree fails. And then what it comes down to is a lot of these things, they may marginally decrease the risk of an individual branch, right? Or they might marginally increase the risk of an individual branch, right? Like this tree now is like twice as likely to fail. But there's like 50 times more non-defective branches in a tree than defective branches, right? So a numbers game, if it's not like something like a dead branch that's just almost guaranteed to fall, you're going to have more likely you're going to have a non-defective branch fail in that one tree you're looking at, that you're not even looking at the branch that's probably going to fail in the tree, That makes sense? So
I guess, yeah, I'm curious, what do you think the implications are for this for track?
I don't know.
Yeah, that's too far off.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just one person with a couple data sets, so, but I mean, I think I hope it's going to raise a conversation, because we just keep adding more defects. Like it's like Pokemon, you gotta catch them all, So I had to throw that in fuse.
So I got one final question here, and I mean, I guess this is most pertinent. This all kind of falls under the umbrella of the storm season. So you have any recommendations for hurricane season based off of everything we talked about?
The majors, like we know the things that are going to fail, right? The leaning trees, the dead trees, big cavities, things like that. Focus on those, and if it's something that is more of a marginal case, mitigate, a little bit. But I think I mean, I just focus on the things that we really know are really problematic, and you're probably gonna do fine, And then if it's something that's a gray zone, like chances are the branch next to the one you're looking at is going to be the one that falls. So
all right, well, it's 1:00, and be respectful of everybody's time. I guess we'll go ahead and end it here. I will be following up with the survey for everyone that is in attendance here, and we'll get you your CEUs taken care of as well. And let me see. Yeah. And so, yeah, thank you so much, Andrew, for being our speaker here today. And I mean, this was, really perfect timing, I think, for the time of year. And I'm looking forward to seeing how your data sets evolve over the years here, because I know it's going to be years, right? So
yeah, I mean, like 5 years from now, I'm like, oh, everything I said was wrong. So we'll find out, But until then.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, thank you again. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Have a good afternoon.
Hey, Larson, why don't you give me a call after this? So